Donald Trump once declared America doesn't need Canada's oil, but by early 2025, he's calling for the revival of Keystone XL, the multi-billion-dollar pipeline directly connecting Alberta's bitumen mines to GF coast refineries. At the same time, he slaps a 25% tariff on imports from Canada, asking for oil, then imposing tariffs. Is this a strategy or a contradiction? And if Canada turns off the tap, who will truly be the one to fall? Many still believe America can achieve energy independence. The reality, the US produces plenty of oil, but mostly light crude. Meanwhile, refineries in the US, especially in the Midwest and Gulf Coast, are built to process heavy crude, the kind that can only be reliably sourced from a few places, with Canada being the most stable. In 2024, the US imported over 4.4 million barrels per day from Canada, making up 60% of its total oil imports. This is an oil that can be replaced overnight. Domestic shale oil is light and unsuitable, while imports from the Middle East or Venezuela are risky, expensive, and politically volatile. If Canada cuts or limits supply, the consequences will be immediate. Gas prices will soar across the US, particularly in agriculture-heavy states like Ohio, Michigan, Illinois, and Texas. The chemical, plastic, and fertilizer industries reliant on oil byproducts will face raw material shortages, disrupting supply chains. Consumers will see rising food transportation and utility costs, especially affecting the middle-class farmers, truck drivers, and skilled workers. America's dependence on Canada isn't just about energy, it's about the very structure of its industrial and economic operations, which trade policies often fail to fully account for. In his first term, Trump dismissed the role of Canada's oil, emphasizing the slogan, American energy independence, absolute energy independence. But by early 2025, he completely reversed his stance. Keystone XL is the lifeblood of energy. If I return, it will be approved again immediately. Keystone XL is a 1,900 km pipeline that transports 830,000 barrels of oil per day from Alberta to refineries in Texas and Illinois. The project was originally cancelled by Obama, revived by Trump in 2017, and then killed by Biden on his first day in office in 2021. Now Trump is not only talking about Keystone as an economic project, but as a strategic weapon to help America secure a reliable oil supply in a world increasingly divided over energy. This shift reflects the reality Trump and the White House are realizing, that self-reliance doesn't mean isolation, and there is no more stable energy source than Canada. On March 3, 2025, Trump signed an executive order imposing a 25% tariff on imports from Canada and Mexico, effective March 4th. The goal to reduce the trade deficit, to protect US production to hit industries Trump believes are being exploited, from steel, aluminum to consumer goods. But the irony is this. At the same time he needs Canada's oil to save the US energy industry, he slaps tariffs on the very partner providing the lifeblood for American refineries. Canada reacted immediately. The Canadian government announced a retaliation strategy worth $155 billion Canadian dollars. Phase 1 tariffs on $30 billion Canadian dollars worth of US goods, mainly beef, pork, poultry, dairy, alcohol, processed foods. And household goods, Phase 2 from March 25 to 2025, targeting an additional $125 billion Canadian dollars, including automobiles, parts, aviation defense, corn, soybeans, and processed meat. Ottawa also warned it was considering measures beyond tariffs, including controlling crude oil and gas exports to the US. My opinion, Trump is contradicting himself, needing oil while imposing tariffs on the supplier. No one can simultaneously ask for energy and wave stick threatening retaliation and maintain strength. This isn't a strategy, it's an out-of-control gamble. In the US, refineries won't run at full capacity. Gas prices will jump by 30 to 50% within weeks. The chemical, fertilizer, transport, logistics, and agriculture industries will see supply chains disrupted. Millions of Americans will feel the indirect impact through rising energy costs from food to utility bills. In Canada, Alberta's revenues will temporarily drop, but long-term Canada has the motivation and justification to pivot its energy exports to Europe, Asia, and domestic markets politically. Cross-border trust will shatter. The concept of North American energy security, and once foundational under NAFTA, will be replaced with competition and suspicion. My view, America will suffer more not just from losing oil, but from losing its leverage in relations with Canada. Once Ottawa understands the value of its leverage, Washington won't be able to bargain so easily anymore. When the oil valve is in someone else's hands, America First will just be an echo in an empty barrel. Trump is resurrecting an energy project for pragmatic reasons, but at the same time, he's undermining the very connection that makes that project feasible. The strategic trust with Canada, reviving Keystone XL, without respecting the partner, is like building a pipeline on cracking land. If Canada stops supplying oil, the US won't just lack energy, it'll lack the foundation for its industrial value chains. Trump remains who will survive if Canada shuts off the tap, and will Keystone XL save America or expose America's vulnerabilities? As I see it, the consequences are no longer theoretical when Canada retaliates with $30 billion CAD in tariffs. The impact will quickly spread across US supermarkets, food supply chains, and household goods. Beef, chicken, bourbon, washing machines, all taxed, pushing prices up during peak consumption season. Phase 2 from March 25th expands to $125 billion Canadian dollars, targeting automobiles, aviation, and agriculture. Industrial states like Michigan and Ohio will be directly affected. GM, Boeing, and Lockheed Martin will be forced to restructure orders due to tightened supply chains. In the US, small businesses will face higher material costs, delayed shipments. In Canada, agriculture struggles, but domestic industries like alcohol and food will have the opportunity to replace US goods. While there's long-term potential, Canada will face rising prices and the risk of self-isolation. The US will have to accept that its closest ally is actively drifting away. From my perspective, the future has two paths, either a fair renegotiation or an ongoing trade war. Right now, the second option is looming. On May 28th, Trump suggested if Canada doesn't want to pay $61 billion US for the Golden Dome defense system, it should become the 51st state to get it for free. Canada's reaction was clear. Trudeau rejected it, and Paul called it delusional. Beneath the surface of diplomacy lies a rising wave of nationalism. Canadians are wearing not-for-sale hats, while US analysts are starting to worry if they lose Canada, where will they get oil, gas, and minerals from? If Canada tightens its oil exports, the US will have to turn back to the Middle East at higher costs and greater risks. If Quebec cuts power to New England, next winter might see domestic coal burning. And if the retaliation continues, unemployment will spread across the Midwest, the heartland of Trump's support. A president who calls Canada the 51st state slaps tariffs on every pound of beef and then begs them for oil through Keystone XL. The question is, when power becomes a bargaining game, who truly controls the oil valve? Millions and millions of cars. As you know, Mercedes and BMW and Volkswagen and many others, and we were restricted from selling cars into the European Union, which is not nice tomorrow, Monday. Yeah, tomorrow. What countries will those go on? Everybody steal, including Canada. When Trump raised tariffs to protect manufacturing, the hope was that jobs would come back. But what happens when that very move causes the entire world to leave? In 2025, President Donald Trump signed an executive order raising tariffs on steel and aluminum imports from Canada to 50%. This decision immediately sent shockwaves through the business communities on both sides of the border, especially in the automotive industry, an industry that thrived on the free flow of goods between US industrial states and Canadian provinces. Within 24 hours, a slew of orders was suspended. Material suppliers in Quebec were forced to pivot. The North American Auto Manufacturers Association warned of systemic disruption in the cross-border supply chain. What made this shock even bigger? This wasn't an unexpected move, but a deliberate escalation from what began in 2018. The US wasn't just imposing tariffs for bargaining purposes. In my opinion, the US is rebuilding its supply chain without Canada. Meanwhile, trade partners from Brazil to Mexico to Germany realized that the US was no longer a politically safe destination, and they were forced to look elsewhere. Canada, which is still part of the USMCA agreement, with reliable industrial infrastructure, a stable legal system, and notably no retaliatory tariffs, suddenly became a strategic alternative. In my analysis, this isn't just a tariff conflict. It's a long-term trust test in international trade relations, and instead of the US being the stabilizing leader, it is acting as a supply chain risk. What the press isn't making clear: when businesses choose Canada, they aren't just avoiding tariffs. They're reshaping the global operating map. A map where the US is no longer the sole center. Every car part produced in Shaw, shipped through Vancouver, assembled in Windsor, and then sold in Chicago is raising a new question: who really controls the value chain? From this perspective, in my view, Canada's rise isn't a lucky break. It's the result of three factors: 1, consistent and open policies; 2, scalable industrial infrastructure; and 3, a favorable geopolitical location for accessing both the US and global markets. While the US uses tariffs as a barrier, Canada uses standards and reliability as a draw. These are two completely different approaches to economic development in the 21st century scene, and one of them is being chosen by the rest of the world. In March 2018, President Trump first imposed a 25% tariff on steel and a 10% tariff on aluminum. Even though Canada was America's top trade ally, it was included in the list. At that time, Ottawa responded with a retaliatory tariff of $12.8 billion, mainly targeting US goods like meat, beer, and motorcycles. But back then, production lines kept running thanks to the momentum of trust. US companies still believed in time that policies might change. However, that didn't happen. From 2018 to 2025, protectionist policies didn't just persist, they expanded. And when the steel and aluminum tariffs doubled to 50% in June 2025, trust was shattered. No international company could plan long-term in such an unpredictable environment. Canada quietly had been preparing for this moment for a long time. SEEP, ports, bilateral agreements, logistics hubs, everything ready to welcome the goods being pushed out of the US. As the United States reintroduces extreme tariff policies, nations around the world are responding, each with their own well-thought-out strategies. Let me break it down for you from my perspective. In Brazil, where beef exports amount to a staggering $122.88 billion annually, they were hit with a 25% tariff, but rather than buckle under the pressure, Brazil swiftly acted, signing a $2 billion trade deal with Canada. This deal involved beef being sent to Alberta and Manitoba, soybeans heading to Saskatchewan, and ethanol making its way to Quebec. The move was not just a business decision, it was a strategic one, preserving nearly 5,000 jobs within Brazil. Next, Mexico, which faces a 35% tariff on its auto parts, made a bold move by shifting $2 billion worth of components to Ontario, Canada. This wasn't just a simple relocation of goods thanks to the Northern Corridor collaboration between the two countries. Assembly lines in Windsor and Bempton came back to life, and here's where it gets interesting. Technical jobs in Canada surged, while many US factories were forced to shut down due to a lack of critical materials. Australia, facing a 30% tariff on iron ore and lithium, responded with a thriller. $5 billion deal with Canada Steel from Perth went to Thunder Bay, and lithium carbonate was shipped to Welland for electric buses. More than 6,000 mining jobs in Australia were saved. The common thread: each country turned to Canada, not just for its market, but for stability. It's not just a one-off situation. Here's what I estimate: France, with a growing hydrogen industry, faces a 30% tariff on electrolyzers. Instead of negotiating with the US, they opted for Canada. A $1.2 billion deal was signed, exporting technology to North America, training local workers, and setting a 4.5 gigawatt goal by 2030. South Korea, hit with a 20% tariff on lithium-ion modules, signed a $1.7 billion deal with Northvolt Canada. LG Chem and Samsung SDI are sending thousands of modules to Windsor. London and Hamilton, thousands of technicians will be trained. Denmark, a pioneer in wind energy, had multiple projects cancelled in the US after the 30% tariff in April. In response, they're likely to partner with Canada in a $1.5 billion deal. Wind turbines will be shipped to Nova Scotia and Saskatchewan. 900 jobs in Denmark will be preserved, and 100 new jobs will be created in Canada, Germany. Europe's auto hub faces a 25% tariff. They'll counter with a $10 billion deal, shifting all key components to Canada to avoid the tariff. Supply chains remain uninterrupted, and Canada becomes the alternative production hemisphere for German cars. As you can see, countries are no longer just exporting goods to Canada. They're actively looking to set up shop there with a focus on long-term partnerships, innovation, and stability. In my view, what we're seeing is a new trade map being drawn. No wars, no huge negotiations, just the quiet flow of supply chains. If this trend continues, the US could become an isolated industrial island. Once assembly lines are up and running in Ontario, no business will move back to Ohio. Once Canada proves its logistics role, the EU and Asia will prioritize bilateral relations rather than waiting on the US. This has happened before in the semiconductor industry, as I see it, when the US lost market share to Taiwan and South Korea in the 90s. And now, with widespread tariffs, that risk is repeating itself with cars, batteries, and renewable energy. We might be standing at the dawn of an era where products made for America aren't made in America anymore. The US imposed tariffs to protect its supply chains, but perhaps those supply chains are moving to Canada. So the question is, in this global policy battle, who's really protecting domestic jobs? And if the future of North American car manufacturing is assembled in Windsor, packaged in Saskatoon, and shipped from Halifax, will the US still be the industrial center it once thought it was? That growth came largely from exports and a rush of US companies buying Canadian goods to avoid future tariffs, while the US economy showed signs of slowdown. Canada quietly posted one of the strongest quarters among G7 countries. Behind the scenes, foreign capital is flowing in. In 2024, Canada's total foreign direct investment FDI rose by 5.5%, reaching over $1.5 trillion by year's end. And that money isn't just sitting in real estate, it's being funneled into trade hubs, AI labs, clean energy infrastructure, and port expansions. These are the long-term bets global investors make when they trust the system won't change overnight. Canada's labour market is keeping pace. By December 2024, the country had created 413,000 new jobs, pushing the unemployment rate down to 6.7%, its lowest in over a year. That job growth was led by sectors like green energy, digital logistics, and advanced manufacturing, precisely the areas where Canada has made quiet, focused investments. The most striking part: none of this has been done with fanfare, no fiery speeches, no global showdowns, just policy, measured, consistent, and designed to deliver over decades in a world that often rewards spectacle. Canada is reminding us that slow and steady still works, especially when paired with strategy. While others chase headlines, Canada is building foundations. The global economy is starting to notice. The question is, will it also follow? So far, Canada has played a quiet game and won, but now all eyes are on Washington. Will the United States strike back or keep stumbling through a maze of tariffs and missed opportunities? Since April 2025, the US has gone all-in on America. First again, Trump rolled out a new round of tariffs, some as high as 50% on Chinese and European goods. The stated goal: bring manufacturing jobs back home and punish unfair trade practices. The real impact: higher costs for US businesses. Retailers are feeling the squeeze, and exporters are struggling to compete in a market that's getting harder to navigate. But tariffs aren't the only card Washington can play. There's talk of renegotiating existing trade deals, especially the USMCA. Some Republican lawmakers have floated the idea of adding stricter Buy American clauses or even penalizing US companies that shift production to Canada or Mexico. Others want to use the Defense Production Act to push companies into reshoring key industries like microchips and batteries. The Biden administration already tried something similar with the Chips and Science Act in 2022. Trump's circle may try a more aggressive version. But at what cost? There's also pressure to outspend rivals on tech. Canada is gaining ground fast with AI, clean energy, and advanced manufacturing hubs, many backed by foreign investors who are increasingly wary of US political instability. In response, Trump allies are proposing a federal reshoring innovation fund that could subsidize US production of strategic technologies, but that fund hasn't passed yet, and time is running out. Meanwhile, the US is bleeding market share in the fourth quarter of 2024. Canada's exports to the EU and UK rose over 11%, while American exporters face rising compliance hurdles and retaliatory tariffs. Auto manufacturers in Michigan and Ohio are already warning about layoffs and plant slowdowns by March 2025. Ford was under pressure overseas, especially in Europe, where rising import costs and shifting production plans hit supply chains hard. And they didn't release exact EU sales numbers, but internal reports showed a clear drop from the year before. The long-term risk: if the US keeps relying on protectionism while others build partnerships, it may end up isolating itself from the very markets that fuel its industrial strength. Trade experts warn that a tariff wall may feel like defense, but it's also a cage. And while Washington debates, Canada continues to ink deals, attract capital, and expand its influence far beyond North America. It doesn't need to fight, it just needs to keep offering what global companies want: predictability, infrastructure, and access to the world. That leaves a tough question for Trump and whoever sits in the Oval Office next: double down on tariffs or pivot towards smarter competition. One thing is clear: if the US doesn't adjust its strategy soon, it may wake up to find the center of North American trade has quietly moved north, and by then Canada won't just be a close partner, it'll be the one setting the rules. What if the real trade war isn't happening on the front pages, but just across the northern border, while the US stays busy fighting over tariffs, lawsuits, and policy gridlock? Canada is quietly rewriting the rules with fewer headlines and more strategy. Ottawa is turning itself into the new command center of North American trade, not by shouting louder, but by moving smarter. This isn't just a short-term shift from electric vehicles to critical minerals to global trade pacts. Canada's playbook is about resilience, not reaction. Meanwhile, America's biggest retailers are already feeling the sting: slower shipments, higher prices, and shrinking margins, all thanks to a tariff regime that was meant to protect, but may now be doing the opposite. So here's the big question: what will Trump or Washington do next? Will we see a bold counterstrike to retake the trade spotlight? Or will Canada's quiet rise continue step by step until it's too late to stop? One thing's for sure: this isn't over, not even close. What do you think America's next move should be? Drop your thoughts in the comments below and let's talk.